The symbolic aspect of language is, I think I said it earlier, it's just laws, it's codes, it's contracts, it's a form of writing. These constitute and describe, the very characteristics of the symbolic. For the early seminars, at least for seminar one, the symbolic is speech. He's dealing with forms of speech and forms of language. Uh, he focuses on an analytic philosopher to kind of prove his point about the emphasis of speech in psychoanalysis. It's How to Do Things with Words by J.L. Austin. There's a sort of performativity to words in which, like, when you say, like, in your wedding vows, I do, there's a performativity that goes on with that symbolic gesture. Or if I'm at the dinner table and I don't see the salt around, and then I see it all the way over at the end of the table, I go, oh, there's the salt. There's a symbolic code that comes with that. That's like, okay, pass the salt, back to me. These ways in which symbolic articulation of a language and speech have an announcement to it, a broadcasting. And so, in a way, we need to pay attention to language and its sort of symbolic articulations, and what the patient is producing in their speech, because that's what's important. And
Yeah,
so,
can I interrupt for a bit? Sorry, Andrew. I'm just curious to hear your thoughts here. There is, I probably I think of the symbolic, the Lacanian symbolic that were just in a bit more too simplistic way, because I connect this to the Heideggerian notion of thrownness, where you're kind of thrown into the world, to a world of signifiers and symbolic meaning. You're already, for example, Leon Brenner makes this point that you're kind of for Lacanians, you're kind of pre-born into this world. You're born into a given. You're already given a name. Most people before they're born, you have a surname in certain patriarchal cultures. And then, of course, you're born into a certain nation, culture, whatnot. But I'm assuming, that is that too simplistic to view the symbolic in that way?
I would say yes. And also, I have a lot of, I cringe my teeth when, not at you, at like when people want to connote Heidegger and Lacan on the same lines.
I
And of course,
agree.
Lacan has a history of reading Heidegger and even translating some of Heidegger's text. He was well fluent in reading German and writing German. He just couldn't speak it. And I know he's hung out with Heidegger a couple of times. With that being said, the symbolic order is not a referential totality of signs in the way that Lacan or Heidegger will say about it in Being and Time. It is not something that is present to hand or ready to hand. It is not something that could be understood or grasped in a phenomenological way. In fact, everything that Heidegger says about this referential totality of signs can be an imaginarized version of what is symbolic. All right. When I
Okay.
talked about speech, so let's say that what I was just describing is an imaginarized form of the symbolic still, that the ego is comprehending, a sort of totality, something that's totalized, something that we can understand. But Lacan's point is that there's something that still escapes that mirror image, right?
Yeah.
In the optical schema, because this mirror image is an inverted totality. Because prior to fixating on that image, I don't have a bouquet. I have something that's inverted and incomplete, just fragmented. But once I stand in that position, I get a fixed illusion that I have a totality that is based upon an inversion, right? And so, um, as in these early seminars, Lacan is dealing with two things. He calls it empty speech and full speech. Now, here's the thing: he does reference Heidegger in terms of empty speech. He says that empty speech can be likened to das Man, or idle chatter. But full speech is what we encountered in this example of, before I tell you about this dream about this woman, let me tell you that this was not my mother, right? This sort of linguistic crisscrossing of the way that speech fails, in which I start to speak so much that I become silent once I get at a breaking point in my analysis about myself. We get at the unconscious. So full speech is the unconscious, and it's something that escapes an imaginarized form and requires a sort of symbolic articulation. So what does that mean? And I know we are only talking about the symbolic. We got to get about the real. I think the real for Lacan in as early as Seminar 1 is predicated on this notion of the real image that escapes the this optical schema. I want to talk about Seminar 2 because this is where we kind of get a huge articulation of what we're talking about. What is beautiful about Seminar 2 is we also get into the death drive. I feel like Lacan was really talking about the ego only to sort of be like, this is why we don't talk about the ego or why we're not focused on the ego. So he still talks about his idea about the ego being a misrecognition. He wants to talk about the unconscious subject. And you being in a computer program, you'll definitely love this because he talks about cybernetics a lot and wants to juxtapose the symbolic order to something like a machine, a cybernetic machine. And interesting, the thing about machines for Lacan is that they break down. They break down because of a something that is real that is embedded into its own logic, right? And so if we have to talk about the symbolic order, not language, but the way that the symbolic order is instantiated, it has rules, it has a logic. And we could simplify this logic to a 0 and a 1. You just need a 0 and a 1 and reproduce that and get some inputs and outputs, and you have a system, right? We see that as simple as a switch. You have a 0 and a 1, you have on and off, you have closed and open, right? And so you just need that. He likens this to, again, we're getting into now, Saussure, the signifier, right? So for him, the signifier, and this is both in Seminar 2 and 3, is different from, again, a Heideggerian referential totality and even the original Saussure's notion of the signifier, which is this binary relation of a sign. A sign is both composed of the signifier, an audio image, and the thing that is signified. Cat, the audio image, and then the signified would be the cat itself. I don't think it has to do anything with a physical cat, but the concept of cat. Lacan is saying that, well, okay, the sign for Saussure has a referent, right? Cat and the thing that is referred to as cat. Then you have that, and then you have natural signs, right? Which have a referent. So for instance, if I see smoke, that indicates that there is a fire. So that you have a natural sign and a referent, right? Or certain birds or whatever, they have a referent that it's time for mating season, so their color changes. That again is a natural sign. And then you have a trace in which there may be nothing present at the moment, but these traces lead to a referent. The signifier for Lacan, which deals with the subject of the unconscious, has a trace, but does not have a referent, right? So this is why the symbolic order is composed of 0 and 1, or 1 and 0, 0 and 1, presence and absence and presence. This isn't anything new, even though I'm saying new terms. This goes back to our concept of negation or Verneinung. What is being affirmed is affirmed in a negation, but also what is being inaugurated from the unconscious is something that doesn't exist, but is something that is echoing something from the subject's past, right? That is being presented to us, right? So that is sort of how it enters into a sort of quote unquote symbolic network. And it repeats because of, and fails because of the death drive, right? That is something that is introduced in Seminar 2 that is different from Seminar 1. And so for Lacan in Seminar 2, he wants to really double down on this notion of plus and minus, because this is what his signifier will entail in his later years, and especially why, even though the thing fails, it continues to keep on going and continue to break down. Because what he says in Seminar 16 about the symbolic order, he gives us a nice definition. He says the symbolic order can be defined as this. It is an accumulation. It is an arrangement, an enumeration that somewhere there is a count. And when there is a count, there is an ordering and there is a symbolic system. So what is that that's being ordering? It's something that has to do with the concept that we're familiar with, jouissance, or for Freud, it is sexual libido, right? It is the id, it is the unconscious, and some of it is ordered through the signifier. And while sounds like very vague, we could put it into simple terms that when I free associate and I continue to stumble upon these, free associative insights, the full speech, what I'm doing is encountering a deadlock, encountering what we talked about earlier as impasses and formalization, right? Now we've marked that down and we've enumerated, we've accumulated, right? And so the death drive isn't repetition, but the death drive is, the sort of failure to totalize, and we have an incompleteness, but the ability to repeat
The
is the
repetition of
ability to
failure,
count.
right? Yeah, it's
Yeah,
kind of failure. Yeah, yeah.
yeah.
Make
It is an operation. It is a unary operation.
Yeah, yeah. In fact, can I just make this point here? I don't know if this makes sense to you. I've been thinking about something Callum Neal wrote recently, where in some sense you can speak of desire still in a very utilitarian kind of way, where yes, you're desiring a virtual object. Yeah, for sure, you can never your desire can never be complete or be fulfilled. But nonetheless, it is somewhat utilitarian where you still think by getting the object, by acquiring the object, your lack will be filled or you can overcome your your bad subjectivity. But I find that the drive is, in its truest sense, non-utilitarian because what you enjoy is the repetition of a failure or a repetition of the deadlock. I don't know if that resonates.